Hello, we are the Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health, or ACAMH for short.
Welcome to you all. I'm Barry Carpenter. I'm a trustee of ACAMH. I sit on the board for ACAMH. That's been a fairly recent position for me, and I've been particularly invited to join the board, which is predominantly psychiatrists, psychologists, to lead on a school-based initiative. ACAMH are very aware, as Matt has just indicated, they're the repository of a lot of knowledge around children's mental health, and they're really keen that we go through the process of transferring some of that knowledge into teacher talk in ways that become accessible to you as teachers. Like you, I am a teacher by background, head teacher 3 times, and latterly an academic. I've just recently retired from my post as Professor of Mental Health and Education at Oxford Brookes University, but retain some connections there and indeed some wider committee work around the area of children's mental health and well-being. I shall introduce our speakers in a moment, but I'm going to be ably assisted today by 2 colleagues, Jan Forshaw and Donna Hill from Coram Life Education, who are our partners in this Ask the Expert venture, and they'll be monitoring the chat. Please make a note of your questions and then do put them through the chat, and Jan and Donna will organise those, send them over to me at the end to read out and get some responses. A word about the topic. As Matt said, it's anxiety, cues, clues and support for young people in school. Why that topic? Indeed, this is the 3rd topic in our Ask the Expert series, and our aspiration is that we will be doing 10 in this series if all goes well. Each of the topics is not random. They have been deliberately selected from the new relationship, sex and health education curriculum that became statutory from the DfE as of this September. When I launched that curriculum for the department back on the 7th of July 2020, it was very clear at that time that there were knowledge gaps for teachers. This is new area. This is areas for us. These have not traditionally been part of our teacher training at either an initial or postgraduate level. And so to implement this new RSHE curriculum, which is statutory, therefore will be inspected by Ofsted, there's a very great need to get that knowledge to the teacher. And that's what these sessions are about, is not to give you direct teaching advice, but to actually give you knowledge about the topic that will enable you to explore teaching. And we've entered into, I'm pleased to say, a partnership with the Chartered College of Teaching. And in the coming months, you'll hear more about that, because we'll now be developing a set of parallel webinars to, for example, the one you'll be part of this evening, which will then deal with pedagogy in practice. What do we do in our classrooms to deal with some of the issues that have been raised in the topics that we've been going through? So our speakers are going to have about 30 to 40 minutes this evening, and then that'll be followed by 20 minutes of questions. So there is plenty of time for you to put those questions. But before we get to the actual content of the session, let's gauge who's with us this evening. And there is a poll about to come up on your screen. And would you enter, please, which type of school you're from? Primary, secondary, special or alternative provision? It'd be helpful for us to have a profile of where you're from. And you start to enter in. Hopefully you can see the poll on your screens. Okay, that's the results are coming up. Great, lots of people from primary schools. That's very encouraging. Good to see a strong secondary representation, and indeed colleagues from special and alternative provisions as well. So a really good cross-section. I can see 1 or 2 people saying they're from the independent sector. Just put in the age range that you're working with, that would be helpful. Okay. And a nursery school. Well, that's really very good indeed to get somebody from the early years settings. The early years foundation stage certainly offers us great opportunities to get through some of the well-being issues that will lay the foundations for children's emotional well-being. Good to see people here from other professions as well. You're welcome. This is primarily a session for teachers, but there's something in here for everyone, having seen the wonderful content that our speakers have planned. So let me come to our speakers for this evening. We have two speakers. I'm delighted first of all to welcome a very eminent colleague, Professor Cathy Creswell, who is a Professor of Clinical Psychology at the University of Oxford. She's also Honorary Consultant Clinical Psychologist with Oxford Health NHS Foundation Trust. Cathy has a very, very strong research profile, mainly in the development, maintenance and treatment of anxiety disorders in children and young people. She has a research group, the Oxford Psychological Interventions for Children and Adolescents group, and they, through a range of methods, both qualitative and quantitative, and systematic reviews, explore what impact for children, young people and their families some of the psychological treatments have. What are the outcomes for children and young people? And anxiety is particularly Cathy's speciality. Cathy has with us this evening Helen Manley. We particularly welcome Helen because Helen has a background as a teacher. Having got her first degree from Oxford in modern languages, she subsequently completed a PGC at Oxford Brookes and went on for a teaching career across primary education for some 11 years and has since gained her MA. And her final dissertation as part of that MA was about school-based counselling interventions to reduce anxiety. And I think probably the motivation from that, Helen is now enrolled to do her Doctor of Philosophy at the Department of Psychiatry, being supervised by Professor Cathy Creswell and Dr. Tessa Reardon. So welcome, Cathy and Helen. It's really good to have you with us, and over to you to present anxiety, cues, clues and support for young people in school. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks ever so much, Barry, and thanks very much for that introduction. We're really delighted to be here, and it's wonderful to see so many teachers and other school staff here with us this afternoon. I imagine you're all exhausted at this point in the day, so all credit to you for joining us, and thank you very much for that. So I'm just going to get us started off by just giving a bit of background about anxiety, and I don't think what we'll be saying here will be anything new to any of you. The first thing to highlight really is just how common anxiety problems are. Of course, all of us experience anxiety and fears and worries at times, but when we're talking about anxiety problems, we're talking about a level of anxiety that's getting in the way of a child's day-to-day life. It might be interfering with school life, with home life, with friendships, and that level of anxiety is still extremely common. So around 2 children in an average UK classroom are likely to experience that level of anxiety that gets in the way of their day-to-day life. And in fact, that number's likely to be an underestimate, because from our data here in England, from a national survey conducted in 2004 to a repeat of that survey in 2017, we saw an almost 50% increase in the prevalence of emotional disorders. So that's anxiety and also low mood over that 13-year period. So actually what we saw in 2015 in that study that highlighted 2 children in the classroom may well be an underestimate of the situation now. And so why should we worry about child anxiety? Well, of course, the main reason is the distress that it causes to the individual child themselves, but also the wider impact that it causes in terms of it being a risk for ongoing anxiety problems throughout childhood, adolescence and into adulthood, as well as other mental health problems such as low mood. But we also know that anxiety can impact on educational attainment, employment prospects and social relationships. So there are widespread implications of anxiety problems early in life. And of course, the recent context that we found ourselves in over the last couple of years has obviously been a time of huge uncertainty for all of us, and for children and young people in particular in many cases. And you might not be surprised that in the Children's Word of the Year competition in the Wellbeing theme, anxiety was the Children's Word of the Year. Certainly, we have seen big increases in the prevalence of mental health disorders, including anxiety, as I mentioned. So I mentioned 2017 data before. In a recent update of that survey, we didn't have specific data on anxiety, but certainly we saw significant increases in mental health problems generally. So in 2017, while 1 in 9 children and young people had a probable mental health disorder, that was 1 in 6 when measured in July 2020. And actually something that's important to point out, particularly as we have colleagues here from both primary and secondary settings, was that actually that increase over time from 2017 to 2020 was actually very similar for both younger children in the primary school age and secondary school age children. So we saw a similar uplift in the prevalence of mental health difficulties across both age groups. So July 2020 was obviously we were quite into full swing of the pandemic by then, and actually that some restrictions had been loosened at that point. So how had the pandemic impacted on anxiety and mental health problems in children and young people? Well, there have been a number of studies that have been conducted, and obviously it's very hard to know for sure because we obviously don't know what the situation would have been like without a pandemic. And as we'd already seen, many mental health problems were already on the rise. And actually the studies that have been done have showed a very mixed picture. So for example, one study in schools in the southwest of England actually found a reduction in anxiety compared to data that when they looked at data early in the pandemic in April and May and compared that to data that had been collected with the same children in October the year before. So at that point, when we were in the first national lockdown, many children reported a reduction in anxiety and an increase in well-being and no changes in depression. However, another study with younger children, which also was conducted in the first national lockdown, found an increase in depression, but again here, no significant change in anxiety. And obviously those were conducted early on in the pandemic, which I think feels like a very long time ago now. And it definitely seems that a number of things will have made a difference to children's experiences. You know, that will have varied during the time points that we're looking at for the pandemic. It will depend on age, it will depend on other things. So a study that we've been conducting in Oxford called Cospace has tried to continue to track children's mental health throughout the pandemic. And we've relied mostly on parent and carer report because we've been able to use that across the age range of 4 to 16-year-olds, but have also had fairly consistent reports from young people's self-reports for 11 to 16-year-olds. And in the Cospace study, we've basically been collecting monthly data from families throughout the pandemic. So we started the study on the 30th of March, just a week after we went into our first national lockdown, and then asked families to complete measures on a monthly basis. And essentially what we found was that mental health symptoms generally did fluctuate, but not hugely when we look at everybody as a group. So what you can see here is the greyed out areas where our national lockdowns, and you can see generally whatever type of mental health difficulty we were looking at, things gradually went up during those periods, seemed to get better as we came out of those periods, seemed to increase again as we went back into a further national lockdown. And this graph isn't specific to anxiety difficulties. It shows you behavioural difficulties, emotional difficulties, which is predominantly anxiety problems, and also attentional problems. And what I just want to show you is really to emphasise how that varied depending on the characteristics and circumstances of the children and families taking part in the study. So here we've split the data by the primary and secondary school age groups, and you can see that for the participants in our study, actually the fluctuations were more marked for the younger children. But also we can see that where families were living on low incomes, so less than £16,000 a year, we saw elevated difficulties throughout the period of the pandemic studied. And then equally for children with special educational needs or neurodevelopmental difficulties, again, we saw these very elevated symptoms throughout the pandemic. So I think what this really highlights is obviously the situation we've been over the last 2 years has been very different for different children, with some being far more at risk of difficulties than others, and some being more affected by the restrictions than others. And one of the things that it's really important to point out is that whereas when we look at the children on the whole, the yellow and blue lines, we can see that as we came out of the lockdown period, so if you look at the end of each graph, things started to improve for our more vulnerable groups, so children on low incomes and children with special educational needs. We didn't see that recovery as children started to come out of the restrictions. So it's going to be really important for us to continue to follow up these children and to continue to keep an eye on the needs of the children who were most vulnerable during the pandemic, to ensure that we're able to support them to be able to bounce back from that experience. So just focusing on the emotional difficulties box in the middle, so this is where we're really thinking about anxiety. You can see here that actually in March, when we were coming out of restrictions, our vulnerable groups were still experiencing highly elevated symptoms. We also could see that other groups seem to be more vulnerable to emotional difficulties, so particularly anxiety, during the pandemic. And this data is from the first national lockdown. And what we were able to do here was to look at, are there children who have different trajectories of symptoms over that period as the lockdown persisted? And essentially what we see here is a slightly complicated picture, but hopefully I can speak about it clearly. And that is that actually about 2/3 of children had low levels of emotional symptoms, so low levels of anxiety and low mood, all the way through the first national lockdown. So that's the red line that you can see at the bottom. So 60% or so of children actually were reporting low levels of emotional symptoms all the way through. However, there was a smaller group who was struggling with emotional symptoms at the beginning and continued to do so throughout. And then you can see there were other groups who started low and problems became worse, and others that started fairly high and problems became slightly better, things became slightly better as time went on. So then we could dig into the data to try to understand, well, who are these children? Who are the ones who were struggling the most during this period? And what we could see is very consistent with what I've just shown you, which is that those that struggled most at some point during this lockdown period were, again, those with special educational needs and neurodevelopmental difficulties, children with chronic health conditions, children where parents reported high levels of psychological distress. And also this group that ended up most elevated at the end of the national lockdown were those living on low incomes. For emotional symptoms, they're more likely to be female, and also those where parents reported higher levels of parent-child conflict at the beginning of the pandemic. So clearly there are some factors there that can help us be aware of which children might be most vulnerable as we come out of the pandemic now, and should we ever be in a similar situation again. We've got a huge amount of data from Cospace about the impact of the pandemic, so please do have a look at our website where you can find lots and lots of reports about the various different findings. So there I've been talking about anxiety and how common it is, and been talking about the impact, what we've learned from the pandemic about the impact on anxiety. But I'm now going to hand over to Helen, who's going to talk more specifically about anxiety and what we see within schools and how it impacts on school life.
Great. Thank you, Cathy. So as Cathy just said, I'd like to move us on now to thinking about what anxiety might look like in the school setting and some of the impact that might have on school life for those who are dealing with it. Just before we do that, I thought it might be helpful to think about some of the reasons children might be anxious in school. As part of my research recently, I've been talking to parents, children and school staff about this, and here you can see some of the ideas that they've shared. Many will already be familiar to you, I'm sure, and you'll probably be able to list many, many more. But as an overview, lots of children will already be anxious before they come into school because of things going on at home. Some will find being dropped off or left anxiety inducing. And from my experience in the primary school setting, at least, that issue isn't always limited to the youngest children. For lots of children, pressure over assessment, however much we prepare them or try to downplay it, will be a source of anxiety, as will making contributions in class. So whether that be asking questions, whether that be speaking in front of peers or others, whether that be answering questions. We need to remember that classrooms are really busy places and can sometimes be quite noisy. So for some children, just the environment can be really overwhelming. Friendships and relationships with peers and adults, particularly over what they might think, others might think, might also be a source of worry. So how might you spot anxiety in your classroom? Again, anxiety may look very different in different children, but here are some of the common things you might see. Children might be late often or frequently absent. They may complain of physical ailments such as tummy aches, feeling sick or headaches. I noticed, for example, that one child in my class would repeatedly feel sick just before assembly or just before lunch. Children may make frequent or repeated requests to go to the toilet. This may be a genuine physical need, or it might indicate a desire to get away or to escape, if you like, from the current situation. Some children may withdraw, become very quiet, or shut down completely. Some other examples, there may be tears, and there may be lots of them. It might be a need for constant reassurance. That might come in the form of needing to be physically close to an adult, for example, particularly for younger children, or needing to ask lots of questions, and possibly the same questions over and over again before they can begin to do something. It may look like anger or other behavioural or emotional outbursts. Some children may refuse to do something they're asked or engage with a task, or actually, short of refusal, just be really reluctant to do something before they can get going, particularly if they're uncertain about what's expected of them. Some anxiety may be linked to specific subjects or lessons or particular events in the day, perhaps, I don't know, changing for PE or going to a particular place where there are lots of people. So, for example, communal areas, perhaps assemblies, or even joining a lunch queue. It's really about spotting patterns. Is there a child for whom a given situation, the same situation, often prompts one of those responses? That could indicate that anxiety might be in play. And one thing it's really important to remember is that what we see in the classroom might not match what's seen at home. Sometimes children can hold it together in school all day, and the emotional and behavioural fallout actually happens when they get home. So it's really important for us as school staff to work closely together with parents and to listen to what's happening at home, to make sure that we're getting a true picture of what's happening in both places. Just because we might not see it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not happening for that child or in that family. So we know what anxiety might look like, and that it's likely that there'll be children who are having difficulties with anxiety in every classroom. But what does that mean for them, and what impact might that have on their school life? Anxiety can lead to sleep deprivation, to physical ill health, and it can result in low self-esteem. Children with elevated levels of anxiety may struggle to concentrate or to focus. This may be as a result of cognitive overload, they're trying to keep too much in their head, or because they're constantly in a state of being hyper alert over what's going on both inside them and around them. For many, anxiety will lead to reduced confidence. Children may be less motivated and find it hard to form and maintain positive relationships, which are obviously really crucial in that social environment of the classroom. In turn, this may mean that they participate less in class sessions. Their attendance may suffer and may progress into school phobia or actually complete refusal to go to school. Ultimately, all these things can lead to reduced academic performance and overall outcomes, which should be also a concern for us. One other important thing to note, sorry, if you could just go back there, Cathy, sorry. One other important thing to note here is that the arrows on these slides are actually two-way. So while anxiety may lead to the things we've highlighted, those resulting issues can also feed that anxiety and increase it, and therefore it sort of creates a bit of a vicious and ongoing cycle. Thanks. So how can we help and support children and young people who are having anxiety difficulties in the school setting? Schools are actually really well placed to identify and support those at risk of anxiety and those who are struggling with it. Schools are well connected with the children they teach. Teachers and other school staff spend a lot of time with children, particularly in the primary setting, and have a lot of contact with families. Because of their experience, school staff have very good knowledge of the children they teach, and they know whether something is normal for children of a given age or whether it might be a cause for concern. Also, schools are known, they're familiar places. They're often fairly close to where families live, not always, but often. And importantly, they're not a clinical or a medical setting, which means that they may not be as intimidating or stigmatizing when it comes to children and families seeking help. All of this together means that quite often educational professionals are the first to be consulted about emerging mental health needs, and maybe some of the first to spot a potential issue. It's important to remember that schools already do a lot to help and support children and young people with anxiety. Many of you here will be running regular PSHCE, RSE or social and emotional wellbeing lessons, so preventative interventions that are delivered to the whole class. Lots of schools offer targeted interventions too, so cognitive behaviour therapy, sessions with emotional literacy support assistants, those ELSA sessions, play or art therapy, music therapy, counselling. In terms of what the research says, some studies indicate that school-based interventions can be effective in reducing anxiety symptoms, particularly in primary schools. However, as many of you here will have no doubt experienced, in the case of targeted interventions, they're often only offered to some children, those who meet particular thresholds or criteria, which means that actually some children who would benefit from them don't get them. Receiving those targeted interventions can also mean that children need to miss lessons or time with their peers. And whether interventions are targeted at individuals or delivered at whole class level, many are short term. They can be really hard to timetable in an already demanding curriculum. They can be expensive to buy in and implement, and obviously have implications for staffing and timetabling, as we said. And also children may struggle to see the links and apply the strategies that they learn in those sessions to other situations where that anxiety might be causing a problem. We know that actually just what you do day to day as teachers is likely to be helpful. For example, research shows that teacher behaviour, teaching styles, the clear communication and use of rules and routines, and effective use of praise and feedback can all affect behaviour and academic outcomes. But at the moment, we don't really know very much about how the things schools do day to day might have an impact on anxiety. So, focusing specifically on primary school settings at the moment, we're currently doing some research into just that. Can what teachers and other school staff do in the day-to-day management of their classrooms help manage and reduce anxiety? And we're hoping that this will eventually lead to the development of training for primary school staff on how to support, manage and minimise anxiety in the classroom. I'll hand back to Cathy now to carry on.
Thank you, Helen. And while we're waiting for that research to tell us more and more about the specific things that teachers and school staff can do just in their day-to-day life in the classroom, what we can do is draw on the principles that we know work within successful treatments for child anxiety problems. Now, the biggest evidence that we have for treating anxiety problems in both children and in adults is from cognitive behaviour therapy. And that's an approach that we use a lot in our work. And we've been very successful in supporting parents to implement many of those strategies into their day-to-day life with children, and have found that we can achieve really good outcomes for children that way. So what we've done is really thought about, well, what do we feel are the key principles that we do in that work to think about how they could equally be applied just in day-to-day life within the school. And I think many of these will be things that you're already very used to doing. And the first one is really just making sure we're really clear about how you or the child or the parents want things to be. Often what we see is an example of what we don't want to see, how we don't want people to be behaving, what we don't want people to be upset about. So the key thing here is to think, well, what do we want to achieve, so that it's easy then to work with the child and the parent to make a very positive plan that's working towards achieving those things. So that might be based on thinking about, what would the child be doing that they aren't doing at the moment. That might be something as simple as coming into school, getting into school on time, being able to say goodbye to a parent, promptly, and be able to get on with the next activity. What changes would you notice? What would be different from what you see now? And what would this child be doing differently from what they're doing now? So it's really about trying to move away from the problem to thinking about what do we need to achieve? So here, if there's a problem with the child being able to come into the classroom, we might be thinking, we'd be wanting to talk to the child about what would they like to achieve. We'd like to hear that from the parent, and also think about that yourself as a teacher. So it may be that the child wants to be able to come into the class on their own. They might feel embarrassed about having to rely on others. They might want to get in quickly, and they want to be able to just put their stuff away and get on with things. The parent may want to just drop the child off quickly without crying or resistance, and not leaving school every day feeling so traumatized from such a difficult separation. They want to be able to leave the school promptly so they can get to work on time. And they might want to stop feeling so guilty about making their child or feeling like they're forcing their child into school. And as a teacher, you might want to see the child coming independently. You might want them to be, them to be able to do that without you having to get involved every time, and very actively encourage them to come in, you know, potentially at the expense of other children who are in the class. And you might want them to settle without resistance and start the task that's been set. So the first thing is a very simple thing, which is shifting our perspective from what the problem is to what we want to achieve, so that we can make a really clear plan with the whole family. And then the next thing to do is to think about, well, in order to achieve this, in order to achieve what we want the child to achieve and what the family would like the child to achieve, what does this child need to learn? And the whole approach really is about trying to create opportunities for children to learn new things that help them to overcome their fears and to create different ways of thinking about their world. So what we're trying to do is to help the child be curious and brave, but actually to do that, as teachers, we need to be curious and brave ourselves, because it's all about exploring with the child, trying to really understand their perspective and helping them to think for themselves, and being brave ourselves by asking open questions, not feeling like we need to solve all the problems and wrap things up, and asking questions where we're not quite sure what the answer might be. So again, it's all quite simple really, and just about asking open questions like, why are you feeling worried? What's frightening you? What do you think will happen if you do X, Y, or Z? What's the worst thing that might happen? What is it about the situation that makes you feel worried or frightened? And obviously the key thing is asking these questions at a time that the child's not going to find embarrassing. So not in front of a big group of peers, but finding a quiet moment. But also the manner in which we ask these questions must be genuinely curious. We're asking because we want to know, we want to understand, not because we're trying to prove otherwise or so on. So it's really critical, of course, that we empathize, that we show that we can see how the thoughts that they have must make them feel, and we help label those emotions. So if a child says, you know, I'm worried that if I answer a question, everybody's going to laugh at me, rather than us say, oh, don't be silly, of course they're not. In fact, we want to empathize and be clear that, oh, well, yes, of course, if I thought that too, I'd be really scared too. That is a really scary thought. So we're not saying they're right or wrong to think that, but we're understanding the emotion that they're having and showing that that's a normal response to that fear. So then we need to think about, well, how do we address this fear? So again, rather than saying, oh, don't be silly, think people aren't going to laugh at you, we might want to think about, well, how can I help this child to explore that thought and to potentially learn something different? And how can I put them in a really good position to learn something positive and helpful? So some examples here are, there might be a child who very rarely asks questions in class and finds that very anxiety provoking. And of course, the thing that we often end up doing is actually not asking that child questions at all, because we don't want to put them on the spot. We don't want to make them feel uncomfortable or awkward or create a difficult situation and add to their fear that maybe that something bad will happen. Maybe some children worry that they'll get told off if they get something wrong. Sometimes they worry the teacher will shout and get cross. And what we actually want is to create opportunities for the child to learn something new. And we want the child to be able to learn what will really happen if they ask a question. What will really happen if I get something wrong? What will the teacher do? How will I cope? So it's about actually trying to create safe opportunities for children to gradually put these things to the test, and we'll come on to that more in a moment. Another example might be a child who misses a lot of school, and the goal is to be in school every day. And actually, by asking very open questions, being very open and understanding, we might get to learn that they're worried that their mum will get hurt if they're not at home and won't be there to pick them up. So actually what we might need to find out is, well, what does happen to mum when they're at school? What would happen if mum couldn't pick me up? How will I cope? And the important thing to say here is, of course, we don't actually know the answer to these things ourselves. And by going through this curious process, we might actually learn that there is a reason for the child to be worried. And then we can obviously help them to solve that problem or bring in the necessary people. Whereas if we try to wrap up these worries and fix things and make it all okay, we kind of close that door and don't get to find out what's going on. So the benefit of these open, curious questions is that, one, it allows the child to really be heard and listened to, and has an opportunity to realise that their feelings are quite understandable, but also it does create an environment where we can also find out if there are problems that need to be fixed. So finally, the next step is then to put those thoughts, put those fears to the test. And with children and young people, as for many of us, we often need to do that gradually. And as we do that, we're going to face problems. And so the key thing here again is not wanting to just wrap things up quickly, which often can be the quicker and more efficient thing to do. But actually, we want to work with children to think about how we can solve problems together and how we can empower children to solve the problems that come along the way. So we've only spoken very quickly about this final part, and I know that ACAMH are busy thinking ahead about ways to share more information on the sort of practical side of things. And here was really more about sharing the research and where we're at with you. But we wanted to just bring in those particular kind of key, very simple messages that can be applied in our day-to-day work with children based on what we know are really important parts of the treatments that we deliver. And we really want to emphasize this point that as school staff, you really can make a big difference. And as Helen mentioned, you have a number of really key tools at your disposal. You know the children you work with really well. You're really experienced communicators. And also, Helen pointed out that you're used to being unfazed and calm in a crisis. And that really puts you in a good position to be curious and be brave as you need to be able to support children who have anxiety problems. Before we finish, we just wanted to mention a couple of studies that we have going on at the moment. We always need help with our research and to help us understand more about how to help children with anxiety problems. And we have a number of studies going on in schools at the moment. Actually, the ICATS and MyCat studies here going on around England and involve providing interventions to children within schools. And Helen's project, the MAPS project, Managing Anxiety in Primary Schools, is also working towards developing interventions to work with teachers to think about classroom management. So if you're interested in getting involved in our research, please do get in touch. We've always got lots of opportunities available. And we also just wanted to share a few resources with you in case you wanted to look further. And so so disclosure here that there's a book here written by me, but it is available through the library. So, but that's basically aimed at parents, but also has a chapter in the back specifically written for school staff about how you might manage anxiety problems within the classroom setting. We also produced a resource that was specifically about managing fears and worries with COVID, but the principles are actually very generalizable to many different areas, and that's freely available on our website, or this will be made available. And we've added a few links to a few other sets of resources. And also thinking about the secondary school age group, over the pandemic, we've been doing a lot of work with young people to understand their priorities for mental health during this particular unusual situation that we found ourselves in. And essentially, they've told us what the priority areas are for them, and they include things like managing uncertainty, dealing with social anxiety, dealing with boredom and also with social isolation, And then we've worked with organisations and young people to produce a range of resources for sharing with young people. So there's some infographics, there's some animations and videos made with BBC Bitesize, and we'll be very soon releasing a drama series that also gets across evidence-based messages within a drama sort of format. So please do have a look at the website there for lots of resources that can be shared with secondary school age young people, and hopefully will stimulate some discussion. So that brings us to the end. So I will stop the screen share for a moment now.
Thank you very much, Cathy. Hopefully everyone can hear me again. Yeah. Thank you, and thank you to Helen. That was such a crisp and insightful and presentation with great clarity. I was smiling to myself very much, Cathy, as you were pulling things together at the end, because the phrase I wanted to sort of open some response to was about be curious and be brave. And I loved the way that in your final slide you gave such an endorsement to what it is teachers can do, the qualities and the contributions that teachers inherently have, and that you tied that in with the be curious and be brave. And I just think that's a powerful message, colleagues, and particularly to hear it from someone like Cathy, because this is new territory for us. Yes, it's always been there, but look at the figures we've heard about the emotional state of children, the rise that was happening before the pandemic. Well, any sane human being knows that it's more than risen. I mean, that 1 in 6 figure that we have for all children's mental health was July 2020, and we're now in January 2022 with 2 more lockdowns that happened since that estimate. And I do wonder when the NHS is going to release some updated figure on that, but maybe it's all a bit too distressing to release. But I think your endorsement about be curious and be brave is absolutely vital. This is a time when we as a profession have got to start to evolve new pedagogies, because we have a new generation of children with a new profile of need as a result of this pandemic. I'm sure, Cathy and Helen, you're familiar with the Cardiff research that's come out, but saying that this is a lifelong footprint on every child. No child has escaped. And I suppose when I was listening to your opening words, Cathy, you talked about, I love that slide about the pupil voice, the word that the children had chosen was anxiety. In the chat, a teacher colleague put, Cathy, that the teacher word of the year would be resilience. And actually, without an evidence base for that, I think they're probably right. And certainly, the work I'm doing with schools at the moment is about building emotional resilience in schools for all children. Because I think the scale of the problem has become such that however many professionals we have, however skillful we are as teachers, there's got to be some ownership with the child of some of these issues, and about self-regulation. A colleague was asking just then about, are there any apps that deal specifically with anxiety? I mean, I know when my daughter was a clinical lead and an OT in child mental health, she has one she uses for self-harm, which is called calm harm, to de-escalate those feelings that would lead to self-harm. I just wonder if there's any comments you want to make around resilience, self-regulation, that might be helpful to colleagues.
Yeah, so well, I certainly think, yeah, absolutely, it's been an exercise in resilience over the last couple of years, and for teachers as much as anybody, if not more than most people. And I think that and I think what we're learning more and more about resilience is it's a mix of factors that are critical for successful resilience. Of course, there are factors within the child, but there's also huge influence of the factors that are around the child, and the structures that they're in, the support that they get from friends, from family, within academic settings, and so on. And so I think that the approach that we've spoken about, which is about really trying to help children learn about their environment, is really about trying to bring those things together. It's trying to create opportunities around the child for positive learning, which they can then internalize to build their own resilience to future situations. Helen, I don't know whether you wanted to add anything further.
No, not only that, actually, I think it's important as well to recognise that we as teachers and parents working with children, we have the ability to influence that as well. So our responses to things will ultimately, model, if you like, or guide the children to perhaps think about their responses. So actually, as we mentioned before about remaining unfazed and calm in a crisis, actually that in itself can be helpful to a child to see the adult response to that, but also actually not being afraid to openly talk to the child about how we as adults deal with particular situations or our particular concerns, and actually to recognize that we all have those concerns, we all have those worries, and perhaps even to start suggesting some of the ways that we ourselves have approached those situations or overcome those situations. Yeah.
And could I add to that and tie in something Cathy said earlier? If people want to look at the work of the Youth Sports Trust, and you're saying there, Helen, about some of the things we've managed ourselves in the pandemic, I think everybody would say they've tried to focus on doing some physical activity, whether it just be a walk. And there's colleagues saying in the chat, they do a circuit each day. There's other suggestions around the physical side of things. The Youth Sports Trust with their Wells Schools programme, and the wonderful idea from Vicky Wells, the National Manager for Youth Sports Trust, about a sports sanctuary, not PE lessons, just a place for physical activity. Children can go again and self-regulate which physical activity suits them. There's a lot of questions coming through about how do they make contact with you. I think everybody's got very excited about possibly being part of your map work, Helen, and the ICATs that you mentioned. How would you advise people to make contact, please, Cathy?
Yes, I'll put our research group link in the chat, and then everybody will be able to see that, and then you'll be able to see all the various contacts. You'll be able to get a bit more information and see the various contacts there as well.
There's a stream of questions coming through around CBT. Is it the only approach that's used? I mean, I'm aware of some schools using the dialectical behaviour therapy approach as well, because particularly for some children with autism, they're not always able to comprehend some of the more cognitively challenging aspects of CBT. I wonder if either of you want to speak to the use of CBT and its application to a school setting.
Yeah, absolutely. So cognitive behaviour therapy is really the only therapeutic approach that has a robust evidence base for treating anxiety problems in children. There have been some trials of other approaches, but really not very many. However, there have now been a lot of trials of CBT, and which have, very convincingly showed that it is effective for the majority of children, but of course not all. We don't have that level of evidence for any other approach. That's not to say they're not helpful. It's just to say we don't know if they're helpful or not. And so, of course, we're in a slightly difficult situation where we have limited resources. So it's quite risky to sort of focus them on areas where we don't know whether there's evidence or not. And it's often difficult to judge this on the basis of our experience of, individual children, for example, because we know that things do change over time naturally. So we don't always know what would have happened if the child had or hadn't had this intervention versus what would have just happened over time. So, for example, there have been some evaluations of school-based programs that are universal, where if you just look at the data from the beginning to the end, it looks like there's been a great improvement. But then when you do a randomized controlled trial and you allocate people either to the intervention or to nothing, we actually find both groups show an improvement over time. So it wasn't the intervention that made the difference. So I suppose it's a sort of rambly way of saying that at the moment, the evidence we have, we only really have sufficient evidence to support CBT. It's not to say other things don't work. However, we can't just look at the sort of pre-post data to judge that. We really need robust kind of randomized trials. You mentioned children with autism, for example, their variants. There actually have now been a reasonable number of trials of CBT approaches with children with autism that do show positive outcomes. However, they tend to be longer and obviously adapted in critical ways to make them more, more manageable for children with autism. So that approach can still be used. And I did see also there was some questions about age, and actually CBT approaches, the principles can certainly be applied with younger children. And a lot of the work we're doing at the moment, we actually work with parents, and we focus on how they can implement the principles of CBT in their child's day-to-day life. So we're not expecting a child to sit down and do a therapy session if they're 5 or 6, but actually we can talk to a parent about, well, how can we help children? How can we help you talk to your children about their thoughts, and how can you help your child put their fears to the test? So certainly there are ways of applying CBT strategies in ways that aren't the sort of formal sitting, doing therapy kind of approaches. Helen, I know, I mean, obviously you've looked at this a lot too, so I don't know if you want to add anything. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I've got nothing to add specifically that I think you haven't mentioned, so no.
There's someone in the chat, Cathy, saying that there's a CBT-based program for parents and young children called Fun Friends. Do we know this?
Yeah, so I assume that that's a version of the Friends program, which came out of Australia. And actually, there's been quite a lot of evaluation of Friends here in the UK. And we can post a couple of links to that in the chat or share them afterwards. There was a large study that was done in the southwest of England of the Friends program. And essentially what they found was that when health staff came in and delivered it, they got a significant reduction in anxiety symptoms compared to sort of PSHE as usual. However, when it was delivered by school staff, they didn't get those same benefits, which they felt were because often it was just difficult to maintain, give it the same amount of time when it was sort of being squished into the curriculum. However, notably, they also looked at the children who were struggling most with anxiety at the beginning. And essentially, they found that group didn't seem to benefit as much from that classroom-based universal approach. So it seemed that overall as a group, there were some benefits when health staff came in and delivered it. However, it didn't necessarily provide sufficient intervention for the children who were really struggling at the start. And there also has been a more recent evaluation by a team at the University of Manchester, which we can find the link to and stick in the chat as well.
Okay, thank you. It's seeming that there is, there are some things that are butting up to school and the school experience very well. I suppose as a researcher myself, I'm thinking we probably need to take some of those approaches another step further now and see how we do root them in the curriculum, particularly now we've got the RSHE as a framework and anxiety is specifically mentioned under mental well-being. We've got, if you like, a statutory platform now that gives teachers the desire to actually go forward and seek resolution to some of these things. There's a question that's come through from several colleagues about this whole thing about catch-up, which the government has been very keen on, and the whole notion of catch-up can create anxiety immediately. They're looking for some advice on how do children step away from that while staying in school, because in some ways, and you did mention school attendance and school refusal, it could send some children literally out of the door and not want to come back. And particularly where children have low self-esteem. I wonder if you've any thoughts around this.
Yeah, I mean, we were really concerned about the narrative that was focused on catch-up, an academic catch-up, because we certainly were speaking to a lot of families who were extremely concerned about that narrative. And also, obviously, we saw that, and we all know that families were not all equally affected, and for some children, due to no fault of their own, there would have been need for much greater catch-up among some than others. And often those might have been children who were most vulnerable to mental health difficulties in the first place. So we were worried about that catch-up narrative, and particularly also feeling, and certainly speaking to lots of school staff, felt that they also agreed that actually children missed out on a lot of different things from not being at school, not just learning the academic content, but actually all of the other things that schools provide for children and young people, which are obviously all equally important, to do with their social activities, to do with physical activities, to do with creative pursuits. So we were really concerned about those things being squeezed because of a pressure to catch up. I mean, in terms of actually what schools can do to manage that, when that's the kind of wider narrative, I might hand over to you, Helen, to see whether you've got thoughts on that.
That's a big question. I think it is, and I've sort of had my eye on comments that are coming through as well, and I think there's quite a lot of comments around actually one of the biggest things and one of the biggest issues for schools is time, and that actually more and more teachers are taking on more and more responsibility for such a wide range of things. And I think it's going to be a really interesting one to weigh up for schools individually in terms of how much time do you dedicate to academic catch-up versus the social side of it and actually the mental well-being. It would, I think it would be wrong to prioritize academic catch-up, in my view anyway, over that social catch-up and the kind of mental well-being side of things, and particularly in the younger years. I think we may rush in too quickly to worrying so much about that the academic loss over the mental well-being. So I think I echo your concerns there in terms of what this might look like for schools.
Yes.
I don't know whether you've got any thoughts as well, Barry. I can see that you're thinking there.
Yes, I'm picking up on some comments. There's some useful tips coming through from colleagues here, and thank you also to my ACAMH colleagues who are putting lots of links into very short digests that'll substantiate some of the things that you and Cathy have been saying. One colleague has said that in the new EYFS curriculum, self-regulation is actually appearing there, and then another colleague is saying they had their RSHE training yesterday and were told to deliver it in tutor time for 20 minutes. Seems very unsatisfactory. Need a more fundamental look at curriculum and timetable, and that is absolutely right. Going back to that phrase from the Cardiff study about the lifelong footprint and the sort of things both of you have said, RSHE needs to be at the heart of the curriculum. Maths and English is the core, but for goodness sake, we need heart. We need compassion and kindness in schools. To deal with some of the issues you said, they can only be dealt with tenderly and with compassion. I noticed that one of the colleagues on the list this evening is Jonathan Reed from Oxford Brookes University, whose PhD I'm co-supervising, and Jonathan's work is around compassion in teaching, and that is going to be vital to deliver any of this, to get into any of these areas, which again some colleagues are saying, goodness, this is very different to what teachers have traditionally had to do, but this is where children's needs are, and our job is to build a responsive curriculum that addresses those. I often say the curriculum is the servant of the child, not its master. And we've had too many years of politically driven curriculum that if we try to continue in that vein, it will alienate so many children and disengage them from being active learners. So I think, for me, what you've laid out today is an excellent foundation, but it's actually a foundation for educational research to take some of these approaches and truly test them out, embedded in a curriculum. Not as a bolt-on, but embedded. Cathy pointed out earlier, the costs of bringing people in, etc., could be prohibitive in schools. So yes, I think there's some radical thinking. There's some questions coming through about mindfulness and the use of mindfulness. I don't know if either of you have experienced there that you'd want to comment on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was actually involved in a systematic review looking at the effects of mindfulness specifically on anxiety in children. Mindfulness wasn't originally developed for dealing with anxiety, and actually with adults, the bulk of the evidence base is very much about where people have chronic recurrent depression. So what has been found there is that where adults have chronic recurrent depression, mindfulness can help with sort of maintaining more positive outcomes over the longer term. Because that was very successful, people then have obviously looked at, can we use mindfulness for other things, including anxiety, and it's often obviously talked about in relation to anxiety and stress. But how does it actually do when we look at it with children and young people with anxiety symptoms and anxiety problems. And essentially what we found in our systematic review is we didn't find any evidence for the effectiveness of mindfulness as an intervention for anxiety problems in children. So and young people, and I can share that in the link as well. And that was surprising to us, because obviously it is something that there's have been quite a lot of appetite for. However, and it's not to say it's not helpful for some things, but specifically when we look at, is it helpful particularly for anxiety, at the moment there is no evidence that it is. And I think, as people have mentioned, within the school day is quite packed, the curriculum is quite packed, so we do need to think quite carefully about what we add in, because I think often when we're adding something in, we're taking something else away. And so we do need to be careful with bringing things that might take time away from just being, having a nice time and doing things with friends, which could be also very helpful for managing anxiety. So at the moment, there's no evidence. There's been a very large study looking at mindfulness in secondary schools called the Myriad trial, which was predominantly also focused on symptoms of low mood. And if you're interested in mindfulness, I'd encourage you to keep an eye on that study. The main outcomes from it have not been released in the public domain yet, but are due to be released in the public domain very soon. And that was a very large school of mindfulness delivered in schools, and it was delivered very well. I mean, some of you may have been involved. There was a high level of training and support for teachers who received really extensive training in delivering it. And so keep an eye on that, because the results will be out soon, and I'm sure will be really fascinating. I mean, that was focused more primarily on symptoms of low mood, but they did also collect some data on anxiety. And I'll try and find the paper with our review about mindfulness and anxiety specifically, in case people are interested.
One of the advantages of the evenings like this, Cathy, is someone like yourself suddenly says exactly what the evidence base is. And as teachers, we often don't get to hear that. And it's good to hear it, because it helps inform our judgments. I think sometimes we have to go into some of the slightly softer stuff. We all know, for example, that regulating one's breathing helps deal with anxiety. When any of us have been into an interview, have we not said to ourselves before we've gone in, breathe? So there are things that, if you like, are natural and intuitive. And if you get that regulated at the start of a day with children, they become better as learners. They're more attuned as learners. They're more prepared for the day. And sometimes it's about, you can see the anxiety rising, they maybe need a physical outlet for that. So maybe it's about doing some on the spot. I've been doing a universal revival of Simon Says, because the whole imitation bit helps with the, Piaget said, imitation's the foundation of all learning. And it's very useful to help the child self-regulate, and in so doing, calming themselves somewhat as well.
And certainly, I mean, the trials that are in the review that we mentioned are very much focused on, can we reduce levels of anxiety symptoms or anxiety problems? So they're not about, does doing this make you feel calmer in that moment, and does it have that immediate benefit for learning or whatever. Those studies are not focused on that. It's much more, and so it's not to say there's not a benefit with that specifically, but it's more to say, if a child's having problems with anxiety, is a mindfulness intervention going to get rid of those problems? And at the moment, we don't have the evidence to say it would.
Okay. There's some very useful resources been put in there. Thank you to our colleagues at Coram who've put in the links to the SCARF work for schools, and you may want to have a look at that. Cathy's now put in the mindfulness link. It is in there as well. I'm waiting to see if there's any more specific questions that are coming through. Donna, I don't know if we've got... Oh, there's one here about getting parents on board if they're in denial that their child suffers from anxiety. And I think you were right, Cathy, when you said, separation is one of the most anxiety-raising things for children. And it seems to me, because I've heard so many schools report it now, that because of the nature of lockdown and the pandemic, for children that hadn't had separation anxiety before in terms of leaving a parent, now because of the fear of COVID, and this is still a fairly subjective statement, I know, but more schools are reporting children not wanting to separate. they only observe a trend. I know it's not hard evidence, but trends lead to investigation that leads to hard evidence, do they not?
Yeah, absolutely. And it would certainly make a lot of sense that, we would expect to see more of those sorts of problems because, of course, children didn't have to do that for such a long time. They didn't get the experience of doing it. Those who may have felt a little bit anxious about it then managed to avoid doing it for a really long period of time. So didn't get the opportunity to learn that they could manage it and it was okay. So I think that observation makes a lot of sense with what we would expect. I mean, in relation to the question about parents being in denial, that's, it's an interesting one. I think that certainly one of the things that we found, we've been doing, one of the studies I mentioned, the ICAT study, what we're doing there in schools is screening children for potential anxiety problems, and where anxiety problems are indicated, we then offer an intervention where we work primarily with parents. And that screening very much came about because we spoke to a lot of parents about potential barriers to seeking help for anxiety and found there were a huge number of barriers. In many cases, parents didn't necessarily recognise the problems the child was having as anxiety. They may have seen them as something else, but also parents talked about, with anxiety, some of these things are normal. So when do they stop being normal? Or parents have kind of got used to them, or maybe parents themselves have sort of similar sorts of difficulties, or maybe parents really don't, so they find it hard to relate and see what those difficulties are. So we've been using this screening approach so that we can then feed back to parents and say, no, it looks like there might be some difficulties. Obviously, your child, whether that's the case. And what lots of parents have said to us is, that was actually, I was wondering about that and I was a bit worried about that, but no one else had ever mentioned it. So so I didn't do anything about it, but now you've essentially validated my concerns, I'm going to do something about it. So I would say that, do talk to parents, obviously in sensitive and very open ways, recognizing, as Helen said, that what parents see at home might be very different to what you see at school, but do have those conversations, don't hold back from them, because actually in many cases parents are kind of waiting for someone else to validate their concerns, and by not mentioning it they might assume that means there isn't a problem. But also I think also in those conversations recognizing that what you're seeing at school they may not be seeing at home, because the child may not face the same sorts of challenging situations in the home environment or with friends that they've known for a long time. So recognizing that because in the same way that because you don't see it, it doesn't mean it's not there at home, it also goes the other way around. And then I think it is just trying to have those very open conversations with parents where you're trying to work together and get on the same page, and sometimes just sharing more information about anxiety and what it is can be very helpful and help parents to make those connections. Helen, I don't know if you wanted to add anything from your experience.
Not necessarily to add, but just to echo those thoughts really. I think particularly in terms of communication, one of the things I found in terms of talking to parents was that, as Barry and you were saying, quite often it's somebody else giving the parent validation.
Yeah.
That it's like, I've had several examples where parents said, I'm so glad you said that. I've been wanting to talk to you about that. And actually going back to the sort of being brave element, actually, it might be down to us sometimes as teachers, as we were saying, sensitively, of course, to be the one to initiate that conversation, because actually parents may not be willing or maybe concerned about raising that issue in the first place. So actually if we can generate that sort of ongoing communication, and if we can be open to responses and recognizing that it might be difficult, there might be difficult conversations to be had, or there may be emotional conversations to be had around that, but to remain open and not necessarily to be afraid of the potential outcomes of that, but to actually want to approach it and work together. I think that's the biggest thing I've taken away from my own experiences in the classroom. It's that actually where parents and schools and teachers can work together, we get better outcomes for the child ultimately, and working together with the child as well. Actually, it's important to involve the child within those conversations too, again appropriately and sensitively.
Thank you. At this point, can I ask our participants if they would go to the link for the survey? We do need the evidence from these sessions of their effectiveness. The survey link has just been posted in the chat. We do have to report to the ACAMH board about the effectiveness of these sessions in the hope that we'll get funding to continue a range of ongoing sessions. So please do take the survey now, and we'll appreciate that feedback. While you're doing that, can I point out that the next of these sessions, which is planned for Tuesday the 1st of March, will be on common mental health conditions and the current context. We are finding that so many people, as we've begun these conversations, want the broader brush stroke to know where things like anxiety are sitting alongside self-harm, are sitting alongside eating disorders, where there's been just a phenomenal increase. And so that session is going to be led for us by Professor Mina Fazal from the University of Cambridge. And again, it is a free session.
Oxford.
Sorry, University of Oxford. And thank you. And it's a free session, so please do share that with your colleagues. Before saying goodbye, I really would like to thank both Cathy and Helen for their contribution this evening. The insights they've given us have been very rich, all supported by strong evidence, but they've also, in the way they've started the presentation, helped us to raise some of the questions that we need to raise as teachers. And I think in some of the questioning that you've posed as participants and some of the comments will hopefully have given both Cathy and Helen insights in the sort of research agenda now that schools are coming more into the realm of mental health. But you know, mental health is a diagnosis and we are teachers, so mental well-being, as it appears in the RSHE curriculum, is a far more appropriate term for us as educators. But certainly this interface is very necessary, and the need to go forward in research in an interdisciplinary way, taking the richness of the expertise that obviously Cathy and Helen have shared this evening, but recontextualizing it into what does that mean for teaching and learning in our schools. So I'm sure you'll join with me in giving a huge thanks to Cathy and Helen, and particularly for the time they put in to preparing such a thorough and rigorous presentation.
Find out more about becoming an ACAMH member and to be part of the advancement of child and adolescent mental health. Visit www.acamh.org.